You're watching WRTV 6 Indianapolis, making a difference for Indiana. This is WRTV 6 News at 6. With Clyde Lee, Dion Willis, weather with meteorologist Bob McLean, and Ed Sorensen on sports. Now, live, WRTV 6 News at 6.
In 1987, an Indianapolis man named Richard Rogers died from lung cancer. He was 52, and he had smoked since he was 5 or 6 years old. So, are the cigarette manufacturers liable for his death? Before he died, Rogers filed a lawsuit, and his widow has continued it. Today, the Indiana Supreme Court heard arguments in this case. Linda Lupier is in our newsroom now and has more on the story. Linda, tell us more.
The arguments today came from the attorney for Yvonne Rogers and from an attorney representing the tobacco companies. The question, if cigarette smoking is an addiction and Richard Rogers was addicted to nicotine, should the cigarette companies have warned him? Were they negligent, or should Rogers have taken responsibility for his own inability to quit? The oral arguments today centered on a number of facts in the case, but the justices also asked many questions. Isn't it true that people have known for years that cigarettes are harmful? Doesn't the consumer assume certain risks? Was there an ongoing failure of the cigarette manufacturers to disclose information about the dangers of smoking? If you know the dangers but are dumb enough to continue smoking, whose fault is it?
It's our position, of course, that what consumers know today is far from what they knew during the time Richard Rogers was developing this addiction to smoking, which happened over time before he was in a position to really even recognize that he had it. And then his efforts to quit were futile.
What we're talking about really are risk of the use of certain products and not a relationship between a particular disease and a particular party. There are certain products that have commonly known risks, and they don't provide a basis for imposing liability upon manufacturers and sellers of those products.
They walk a line between saying everybody knew they were dangerous and denying that they were dangerous.
So far as the attorneys involved know, no court cases of this type involving smoking have been successful. The Indiana justices will decide this one in due time. And Clyde, we have an interesting note. The attorney for the tobacco companies compared their product to butter and alcohol. Too much of either can be dangerous to your health. But does that mean that the manufacturer is responsible if you overindulge?
Yeah, you don't see any warning labels on butter, though, that's for sure.
No, not on the cows either.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks very much, Linda.
You're watching Central Indiana's only 24-hour news service on Indiana's own WISH-TV, Channel 8. Now, Mike Ahern, Debbie Knox, Ken Owen, meteorologist Cliff Nicholson, and sports with Mark Patrick. 24-hour News 8 continues now.
A court case with more far-reaching implications is under consideration by the Indiana Supreme Court. It's an issue of who may bear responsibility when smokers die from lung cancer. Special assignment reporter Eric Halverson tells us that's given rise to an unusual comparison between cigarettes and butter.
The Surgeon General has warned about the hazards of smoking and the potential for addiction to nicotine. But in the case before the Supreme Court, the question is, when did ordinary consumers know it? In this case, the ordinary consumer was Richard Rogers, a man who died from lung cancer at the age of 52. His attorneys argued that cigarette companies must bear their responsibility for that death. Attorney Michael Holland says Richard Rogers was surrounded by smoking from an early age and was addicted to cigarettes before there was any warning of that hazard.
It's our position, of course, that what consumers know today is far from what they knew during the time Richard Rogers was developing this addiction to smoking, which happened over time before he was in a position to really even recognize that he had it. And then his efforts to quit were futile.
But the attorney for tobacco interests says the risks of smoking have been common knowledge for years, as have the risks from butter, with its impact on cholesterol. So he says it becomes a matter of choice.
There are certain products that have commonly known risks, and they don't provide a basis for imposing liability upon manufacturers and sellers of those products.
Wagner offered some of history's attitudes toward tobacco to support his contention that Richard Rogers should have known the dangers. But Wagner says he could not acknowledge the widely accepted links between smoking and lung cancer. So now the Supreme Court will decide whose arguments were the strongest and whether this case deserves a trial by jury. Eric Halverson, WISH-TV News 8 on special assignment.
The court is not expected to issue its conclusion for several weeks.
You're watching Central Indiana's only 24-hour news service on Indiana's own WISH-TV, Channel 8. Now, Mike Ahern, Debbie Knox, meteorologist Cliff Nicholson, and sports with Mark Patrick. 24-hour News 8 continues now.
An Indiana woman wants cigarette makers to pay for the death of her husband, and she wants the Indiana Supreme Court to order the trial to make that case. Today, the court heard arguments from an attorney for Yvonne Rogers, whose husband Richard died from lung cancer, and from an attorney representing a tobacco company and its dealers. The family says Richard Rogers didn't recognize the dangers of smoking until it was too late.
The evidence was that he started smoking cigarettes at a very young age and continued throughout his life. And he was addicted to cigarettes before there was ever any warning of danger of addiction.
There are certain products that have commonly known risks, and they don't provide a basis for imposing liability upon manufacturers and sellers of those products.
A ruling on the case is not expected for several weeks.
You're watching WRTV 6 Indianapolis, making a difference for Indiana. This is WRTV 6 News at 6. With Clyde Lee, Dion Willis, weather with meteorologist Bob McLean, and Ed Sorensen on sports. Now, live, WRTV 6 News at 6.
An Indianapolis woman who claims that smoking killed her husband is going to get her case heard in the Marion County Circuit Court. The Indiana Supreme Court heard arguments from Yvonne Rogers' attorneys and those representing tobacco companies earlier this week. The court split 2-2 in its decision, so the case will come back to Marion County for trial. Richard Rogers was 52 when he died from lung cancer in 1987. The lawsuit contends that in spite of trying for a lifetime, he was unable to break his addiction to nicotine.